Hello and welcome to the second part of our series on personal identity. So we're going to be picking up from where we left off last time, and to briefly summarise, Locke's system of psychological continuity seemed to offer us some of what we wanted, such as identity carrying across cases of teleportation, and was clearly a better solution to simple physiological continuity, because it did allow for at least some change across time. However, we then did find very quickly that it did start to show some cracks once we asked whether direct continuity was necessary, deciding that it wasn't, and then equally deciding that indirect continuity wasn't sufficient. So, when we left, we had a bit of a dumpster fire of an answer going. And so this time we're going to look at the animalist's approach and quickly find out that it simply doesn't work, and then we're going to turn to Hume and see if he can fix this problem. But he attempts to do it by dramatically changing the game that we seem to have been playing. So the animalist says that maybe we should trace identity through the animal that you are that exists through time. This is a kind of model that builds off of physiological continuity, but can afford us the ability for change across time. To give the devil his due, it is worth noting that Locke did actually consider this as an option, and it's exactly what he applies to trees and animals. He just didn't think it was enough to support the complexities of human identity. But seeing organisms as the restriction for identity is supported by the claim that it seems to solve the too many thinkers problem. So the too many thinkers problem arises when, as it sounds, there seems to be too many thinkers in any instance. So the argument goes as follows. Premise 1. There is a human animal sitting in your chair. 2. The human animal is thinking. 3. You are the only thinking being sitting in your chair. So, 4. You are identical to the human animal. If you're a Lockean and think that psychological continuity is where you are and not in the physical animal, then it seems that you have to deny premise 3 in this argument and claim that you aren't actually the only thinking being in your chair. There's you, and also a thinking animal, which is a human. Now we have too many thinkers, so there seems to be two minds where there should only be one. So as the Lockean, you, in the sense of identity, exist beyond that of the animal, which is where you're sat. But then the animal's brain seems to do all the heavy lifting that's needed for the you to exist. I think very few people would deny that the brain can think. So if animalism can solve this too many thinkers problem, and Lockeanism isn't able to do so, this could give us a really good reason to accept animalism and take it as that is where identity is held. However, like most things in philosophy, once you put the system under scrutiny, it does kind of fall apart. So, the problem of animalism arises when you consider what would happen if you were to remove someone's brain and then plugged it into an experience machine in a vat. When this happens, the animalist has to give one of two responses, both of which end up wrought with problems. So if the person says that the brain stops being the animal, which seems sensible, if you choose this option, you run into the problem in which the brain is no longer part of any actual animal, and so its personal identity has to be surrendered, because there isn't an animal there. Yet this brain that we've now inverted is still equally able to think and experience as it was before. And because it can think and experience, there clearly is still a thinker in there, despite it not being part of an animal, or despite it not being an animal. So the animalist either has to tell us here that this new thinker that's in the vat now was created when the brain was removed, which seems really ad hoc and ridiculous, or say that there was already a thinker in the brain, which is different to the animal, and thus now we've fallen back into the original problem of too many thinkers. Because now there's the animal's thoughts, and you can separate the brain from the animal, and the brain still has thoughts. But before you separate the brain, that brain must have still been having thoughts separate to the animal, because the identity we attribute to those thoughts can't have been the animal's identity, because you can separate the two. The other option for the animalist in this case is to describe it as an example of extreme amputation. And so you would essentially say, well, of course, that brain is still the animal. That's where the animal is. The problem is, it would be really hard for the animalist to justify, especially considering that the body could be left in a perfectly safe vegetative state and would be the remainder of the body. So you'd have about 90% of the animal isn't the animal, it's the brain that is. And considering the point of animalism is to get away from prioritizing people's brains and thoughts over what the animal is, to solve the problems of psychological continuity that we had last week, then you can't use, well, that's where the thoughts are, so that's where the animal is. Because if you do that, we've unfixed everything we were trying to fix. We've just gone back to square one. And likewise, if you were to cut off 10% of an animal and cut its leg off, you wouldn't say that the animal follows the leg. You'd say that the animal follows the rest. And here we get into this kind of ontic vagueness of what an animal is, because we don't really have a coherent idea of it. So we're going to say, if you cut a finger off, well, the animal that keeps living without the finger is where the animal is. The finger just dies. But if you took an animal and somehow cut it perfectly in half, and then it lived as two separate and distinct animals for the rest of its life, did you just make two identities out of one, or are they half identities? And strictly speaking, neither of those answers are allowed, because identity has to carry on. It has to be a one-to-one movement. You can't have a 1-to-2 or a 2-to-1. And there you get into some really messy metaphysical issues. So we seem to be in a whole load of hot water regarding where personal identity exists. And this seems to be universal, whether we go for psychological continuity, like Locke suggested, or whether we go for the animalist approach. Because both versions can only kind of give us half of what we want. So like we said, the animalist can't deal with teleportation, and the Lockean can't really deal with forgetting stuff without letting his theory fall apart. And so Hume comes in and basically just denies the main idea of the conversation and says, well, people don't actually exist, strictly speaking. We just kind of invent personal identity so it's easier for us when we talk about things. Yeah, it's pretty out there. So, to quote, the identity which we ascribe to the mind of man is only a fictitious one, and of a like kind with that which we ascribe to vegetables and animal bodies. It cannot, therefore, have a different origin. End quote. So here he denies the Lockean sense that, we could be something different from animals. To him, there's just no justification for thinking that. Because it is important to note that Hume was a very serious skeptic. He basically thought if you couldn't see it, you weren't really justified in thinking it was there. So Hume offered instead a bundle theory. And Hume's bundle theory states that there's basically nothing to identity, let alone personal identity, beyond perceptions and how they relate to each other. And Hume, like Locke, believed that we were only sensible to perception, so that's the only way we could gain information of the outside world. But Hume noted we were also only ever actually sensible of ourselves, and we're aware that we're thinking, when we're perceiving something, or when we're literally thinking. And Hume realised that these perceptions never actually seem to hold anything more than the literal perception at hand. So, if you're experiencing hot, you're experiencing the experience of being hot. You're not experiencing the experience of being a person as well. And he thought it was rational to think that personal identity existed outside of this unless we could discover it. So he thought that personal identity would have to be able to be discovered through the perception of an unchanging self, which was present in every perception you had, and which he pointed out just simply isn't there, or at least for himself, and I can affirm for myself as well, and I should think everyone else. So, simply put, you can't ever perceive identity or experience yourself as yourself beyond just seeing that there are experiences and attributing them to yourself. And Hume really wasn't willing to make the same move that Locke did and just kind of pin it onto a god and say that, well, yeah, it has to exist because this is how we live our lives, and there's a big guy in the sky who's going to do us a favour and keep track of everything. Hume was not down to play that game. So he believed that we genuinely couldn't think of the self as anything more than just a bundle of distinct but related individual perceptions that kind of follow each other through time. And Hume supported his claim by combining the premises that there is nothing in a perception save that exact perception which we've just discussed, and that perceptions are distinct from each other and prone to complete change between each instance of perception. And both of these, again, Locke agreed to. So we don't experience anything but the experience of hot within the experience of hot. But then, just as equally, you could experience the experience of hunger next. And there's not really anything that carries across there. And they can completely flip and there's no continuity between them. And if there's no continuity between your perceptions, then there's no way you can actually perceive a self that genuinely exists across them. And what's really interesting for Hume, though, is that he really didn't understate the value of our ideas of identity and what they had. He just said that they, strictly speaking, weren't true. So he basically thought our concept of self came from us confusing similarities to being identical. And so he said, to quote, "We have a distinct idea of an object that remains invariable and uninterrupted through time. And this idea we call that of identity or sameness. We have also a distinct idea of several different objects existing in succession and connected together by a close relation, and this affords a perfect notion of diversity." End quote. So in the latter case, where there's just a lot of things that are similar to each other, but they're not actually the same thing, that's the category he thought that we were in as thinkers. That the mind that's now isn't the same me as the mind that's been. It's just that we're connected, and although distinct, I have memories of what it's like to be me, and you don't. So there, strictly speaking, isn't actually a me that exists over time, nor a you. But we just kind of act as if there is. And he gave quite an interesting example to prove why we can't actually say, well, there is personal identity because I know it's there. So he thought that imagine if you were reduced to even lesser than an oyster specifically. And he said, suppose that you only have one perception, which is thirst. Again, an odd thing for an oyster to experience, but we'll go with it. And he asks, can you think of anything outside of that perception? No, you can't get outside of the experience of thirst from just being thirsty. And so he asks, well, if not, surely the addition of other perceptions can't give you that notion. So you can't experience thirst and hunger and get a concept of self. You can maybe combine the two perceptions to get an idea of something else, but you can't ever get outside of just instances of perception. But what's interesting is Hume's able to fix a lot of the problems we have. So, sure, we've denied the existence of people across time, but Hume says, well, it's a way that our brains function. We kind of merge causality and just try and track things through time, so we act as if things are the same thing that change, even though strictly speaking it's different. And he can just solve the paradox of the ship of Theseus. I mean, sure, he denies the fact that the ship can survive change, strictly speaking, but he can just respond and say that, well, we invent an identity for the ship as one that exists across time, due to us being able to track its resemblance to itself, its sympathy of parts, which was the term he used for working together and relying on each other, in the same way that animals have different parts that work together. So you can track an animal by that clump of organs that seems to move around together and work as a team. And also the sameness of purpose, so it's a boat that sails around. If the ship of Theseus started flying, we'd say, hang on, that can't be the boat. But provided it keeps sailing, yeah, it's kind of doing the same thing. And so to Hume, the answer as to which of the ships is real, in the strictest sense, is just, well, as soon as the tiniest atom changed from the original ship of Theseus, the ship of Theseus was destroyed. It just doesn't exist anymore. But at the level of our conversations, which ship of Theseus is the ship of Theseus that we want just becomes contextual and based on syntax. And so it's not a paradox anymore. If you ask, out of the two, the one that's made of the old planks that are rotting out and the new one, which one's the ship of Theseus? The response could literally be, well, it depends. Do you want to look at the old one in the museum, or do you want to sail it across the seas? Because if you want to sail it, the new one is. And here Hume, he really seems to have solved all of the problems by just not playing the game. He just says there aren't people. There isn't identity across time. And we've got no reason to think there is, other than that we confuse similarity to identity. So, in conclusion of our two-part mini-series, we've discussed how we can try and support personal identity through time, and how the Lockean response fails with instances of being too demanding and not allowing for you to, say, forget what you had for breakfast without destroying yourself, or being too loose and allowing you to genuinely, authentically become Napoleon by getting his memories, and how those responses don't work. But it offered us good solutions and kind of the responses we want to cases of teleportation, or say of body swap cases. And likewise, we found that animalism was basically just as much of a dumpster fire, where it can't address for issues of if the mind is separated from the body, because we don't know which one the animal is, strictly speaking. And also how seriously it fails to address our intuitions in the teleportation case, where just the animal is destroyed and a new animal is created that's completely distinct. So we turned to Hume, and Hume just basically said, don't play the game, people don't exist, but you are still allowed to act as if they do. And for at least the time being, unless there's a large demand for expansion, I think I'll leave personal identity with just these 2 episodes for the time being, and may return to it at a later date. So thank you very much for listening. As always, the references for quotes are in the description. And if you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe, and click the bell button if you'd like to be notified when future episodes come out. Thank you very much for listening.